Midnight Narratives Audiobooks brings you Star of the Void, Book 8, The Star Hunters, by D.R.Varyn. Book 8, The Star Hunters. Prologue, The First Hunt. D.R.Varyn. I first learned how a system dies from Mara Den. Not in person. Not at first. Her report reached us through 3 fractured relays, 2 pirate mirrors, and 1 medical packet from Aldara, whose authentication chain had been patched so many times Arlo nearly called it a ghost before the truth inside it made mockery feel obscene. Mara had been in the upper emergency gallery of an Aldara clinic, with blood drying on her sleeve, when the first survey platform feed came through. Aldara had already survived the Empire once, if survival is the word we are willing to use for a world stripped by policy and taught to call theft stability. By then my name had become rumor in the outer colonies. To some, rebellion. To others, permission. To Mara, I suspect, proof that someone in the dark was still making choices the Empire could not fully script. The survey operator on the feed sounded calm in the precise way people sound when they are close to breaking. Primary star output dropping by 0.4. No flare event. No ejector. Spectral compression inconsistent with known interference. Behind her, the platform bridge flashed amber, while technicians moved like men trying to solve the wrong disaster quickly. Mara asked for reactor condition. The answer came back simple and wrong. Our reactor is stable. It's the star. There is no proper frontier phrase for hearing a woman report that a sun has become uncertain. Institutions would have found one. Localized stellar failure. Temporary observational loss. Root contamination. The Empire has always loved language because language lets cowards survive the decisions they force on others. Mara did not have that luxury. The beacon line failed first. Not power. The beacon itself, still transmitting, yet no longer there. Then the platform image shook from a change in light rather than impact. A technician reported loss on the outer hull, not venting, not damage, simply loss. His last words in the clean file were worse than any scream. Something is taking measurement faster than matter can argue. Then the channel tore white, then black, then returned for 3 seconds to show the platform hanging against a star that had become smaller. Not apparently. Actually. One edge of the platform went away, then another. Its transponder repeated a distress stamp from 3 seconds in the future, and the feed folded inward like paper touched by flame. Mara told the boy beside her the truth because the dead deserved better than euphemism. The hunt, she said. She did not know she was right until 6 more systems began reporting the same dimming along a line no natural disaster should have known how to follow. I carried that report into the first councils after Xyraxis. It mattered because it turned old terror into human witness. We had read architect archives. We had seen records of disciplined stellar extinction. We had survived the wound at Xyraxis. But Mara's feed gave the war a frontier floor, clinic lights, medics, blood, a boy asking what had happened while a son died on the wall. That was where Book 8 began for me. Not with strategy, with proof that hunger had reached the living. Chapter 1, After Xyraxis, Retreat has a taste. Metal first, then heat. Then the ugly aftertaste of things left unfinished because survival required insulting every better instinct you possessed. The Black Tempest came out of the Xyraxis run with half her pride burned off and just enough coherence left in the hull to pretend she had chosen the shape of her damage. Tamsin kept us alive through the final collapse by flying as if hatred were a navigational tool. Briggs kept the engines from becoming philosophy. Arlo kept the root overlays from turning into lies faster than we could interpret them. And Naira came back breathing, conscious, and altered enough that I no longer trusted any sentence beginning with the word merely. We ran dark across the edge of Karmara Rift, with coalition ghosts scattered behind us, and the old root architecture behaving like a wounded animal that had not yet decided whether to die or bite one more thing before it did. Somewhere behind us the first seal had collapsed. Somewhere beyond that, Rourke would already be counting losses and teaching himself the wrong lesson from each one. I stood on the command deck and watched Arlo strip dead signal layers away one by one. "Give me what's real," I said. "That is a rude request in this part of space," he answered. "You're young. Endure it." He pushed a narrow tactical field across the main glass. Surviving coalition packets. Broken relay trails. 2 stars along the nihil edge dimmer than their last confirmed surveys. A burst from Reservane's outriders tagged in pirate cipher simple enough to qualify as prayer. Something eats the light. No one laughed. Briggs came up from engineering with burn residue along one sleeve, and the expression of a man whose patience had recently been used as fuel. "She'll live," he said. "Your ship or Naira?" Tamsin asked from the helm. Briggs looked at her flatly. "Yes." That one is the ghost of a smile and nothing more. The truth sat heavier than humour. The Black Tempest remained special in exactly the way I distrusted. Not invulnerable. Not chosen, but increasingly entangled with old support architecture that treated her less like an intruder and more like an adjunct tool left waiting for operators extinct enough to be inconvenient. We had already seen the ship beneath the ship. Xyraxis had made that hidden layer matter under fire. Now the debt had come due. Naira remained in the med chamber because Briggs had bullied the universe into accepting that altered pulse pattern still qualified as a medical concern, even when the patient could describe 12 active root failures with her eyes closed. I had left her there under protest because command is, among other humiliations, the repeated act of choosing what you do not get to watch personally. Tamsin rotated us through a minimal burn arc and said, "Say it." I looked at her. "Say what?" "That this is no longer a road trip with a theology problem." Arlo made a noise very close to choking. Briggs did not. "She's right." Of course she was right. That was the burden of good crews. They force honesty to arrive before a captain has finished bargaining with it. Xyraxis had been the hinge. We had spent too long asking what the old network was, and why civilized space had spent centuries misunderstanding locks as roads. Seal failure, dimming stars, and the thing behind the locks had finally supplied the honest answer: appetite without ideology. Now appetite was moving. "This is war," I said. No one argued. That was worse than argument would have been. Fresh frontier bursts continued arriving in broken sequence. Survey loss. Route thinning. A customs convoy found adrift with every clock on board 2 minutes apart from itself. A grain hauler out of Aldara reporting that its escort frigate vanished between status pings without emission or debris. Every message had the same undertone. Doctrine built for pirates, imperial squadrons, and human treachery no longer fit the thing moving across the stars. Arlo highlighted a bent line of losses pushing out from Nihil Abyss through obsidian lanes toward the dead cluster. "They're not random," he said. "Natural disasters rarely are," Briggs muttered. "These aren't natural." Arlo tapped the pattern again. "They're following permission failure. Gate wounds. Command collapses. Wherever the root sheath is weakest, the losses intensify." I stared at the line and thought of Meridian, of records that described stars sacrificed with discipline, of architects who had built roads because they had already lived through what followed when roads became open mouths. "Can we predict it?" I asked. "Not well," Arlo said. "Not yet. That meant people would die while we learned." Tamsin glanced back over one shoulder. "And Rourke?" "He'll adapt," I said, "because he's still Rourke." That mattered. Human wars did not vanish because a greater enemy had entered the story. They merely became more desperate. Rourke would not stop being dangerous simply because the galaxy had found something worse than empire. He would become more dangerous because he would decide that survival itself justified possession. The hatch opened. Naira stepped onto the deck. She looked steady enough to offend me. Too pale, too still, a person holding herself together by concentration rather than comfort. "You were supposed to stay in med," I said. She came to the forward glass without answering the complaint directly. "Med cannot teach me what the stars are doing." "That wasn't the assignment." "No," she said. "It never is." Briggs muttered something about impossible people and portable mutiny, but he did not tell her to go back, which meant he had already lost that argument. Naira studied the tactical field. Her eyes moved across the bent line of dimming systems, the broken bursts, the root scars. Then she touched one point above Kamara with 2 fingers and said, "It isn't hunting by destination." Arlo looked up sharply. "Then what is it hunting by? Relation?" The word moved through the bridge like a cold current. We had heard it before. At Aetheris, at Illyros, at Xyraxis, the old network and the things that wounded it did not think in the polite vocabulary of human maps. They thought in access, sequence, command, relation. "It's learning the broken places," Naira said. "And the broken places now include us." That tightened the room in exactly the way I did not enjoy. Tamsin turned back to the helm. Wonderful. I was hoping we'd become strategically intimate with extinction. I looked from the tactical field to Nira and felt the shape of the next obligation settle into place. We're not chasing answers anymore, I said. No, Nira answered. What are we chasing? She looked past the glass toward stars already beginning to fail. Time. Chapter 2. The Pattern of Hunger. Arlo built the first useful map of the enemy in the system's pit, surrounded by recorder stacks, ghost drones, stolen signal fragments, and the kind of exhaustion young men mistake for proof that the body will forgive them later. The line out of Nihil and Zyraxis was real. We all knew that by then. Losses stepped outward along wounded architecture, dimming stars, vanished ships, relay deaths, root scars. But the line was only the bruise. Arlo wanted the injury beneath it. I found him under half-lit glass with his hands moving faster than his face could hide fear. The data resisted every ordinary category. Human wars produce readable numbers, drive signatures, supply churn, casualty ladders, false customs overlays, fuel draw. Terrible things mostly, but trackable terrible things. The predators were rude in ways reality had not previously confessed possible. He showed me 3 layers. The first was physical loss, dimming, vanished ships, beacon failure, hulls made absent without violence. The second was sequence damage, clocks disagreeing, return bursts arriving before initiating signals, relays transmitting from positions that could not host them. The third was what he had stopped calling noise because noise does not repeat with contempt. Silence pockets. Dead wedges in the route where relation itself lost confidence. Ships entering those wedges came back wrong or did not come back at all. When Arlo stacked the layers together, the line became something worse, not a path. Hunting lanes. Tamsin saw it and said what none of us wanted. So it isn't wandering. No, it was not wandering. It was following broken permission. Gate sheath damage, command collapse, wounded root relations. Aetheris had measured intent. Illyros had measured relation. Zyraxis had failed as command. The thing behind the locks was using those wounds like scent. That was the part I hated most. We had not merely survived Zyraxis. We had helped make the new map legible to the thing hunting through it. Briggs pointed out 2 Kamara systems that had not yet fallen despite lying on probable approach. Arlo widened the overlay. Pirate traffic, convoy clutter, false headers, black flag relays thrown up by Ressa's people with more spite than elegance. Irregularity. Asymmetry. Dirty movement. These sectors resist because they are ugly, Arlo said. You're welcome, Tamsin answered. From that insult, doctrine began. Staggered movement. Relay noise injected with purposeful asymmetry. Decoy signatures that were not fully false because pure falsehood would teach the wrong lesson. Pirate wolf packs held wide enough to look like disorder, and dense enough to punish narrow feeding geometry. Not a victory plan, a survival language. We can slow them, Arlo said. I asked him how. By making reality uglier. Briggs called it the first sensible doctrine proposal of the day. I told Arlo to write it clean enough for pirates, medics, convoy masters, frontier quartermasters, and frightened captains who still believed maps were honest. He looked at me as if I had just handed him authority without warning. In a way, I had. Pattern of hunger, hunting lane relation, disrupted permission doctrine, do not move symmetrically under dimming conditions, do not trust clocks in deadlight zones. When stars begin to narrow, assume approach is already underway. By the time he finished, the hunting lanes no longer looked like inevitability. They looked like a problem. Problems can kill you. Problems can also sometimes be taught to bleed. Chapter 3. Dead Light Systems. The first dead light system should have convinced me to stay farther away from the next one. Instead, it taught me the shape of the war. We came in on low burn toward a system the charts still named Cerevan Reach, because maps are sentimental creatures and hate admitting when meaning has moved on. The local star still burned. That was the insult, not gone, not even half gone. Merely wrong in a way that made the eye distrust its own memory of brightness. Convoy wreckage drifted around the inner trade line in a silent wheel. No battle scoring, no pirate strip work, no missile cones. Hulls opened in neat failures or not opened at all, as if ships had simply lost enough agreement with existence to remain useful. Tamsin flew us through the debris field with both hands light on the controls and every muscle in her shoulders ready to betray violence if the universe asked for it. "I hate places that look already finished with me," she said. "Then you've disliked half the frontier since Nixara," Briggs answered over comm. "This one is more intimate." Arlo fed recorder ghosts across the main display. Time divergence, relay spill. A customs escort transmitting docking courtesy to a station that no longer existed. The usual indignities. Naira stood in the threshold behind the command rail. Not at the glass this time. Closer to the center of the ship, as if the ship itself helped her remain proportioned to her own body. "Don't touch the inner orbit," she said. I didn't ask how she knew. I was past that stage of leadership. We found survivors in the shadow of a cracked ore transfer spine. 43 people sealed into 3 emergency compartments, with 1 failed recycler, 2 field med patches between them, and enough discipline left to stop screaming when the Tempest silhouette crossed their viewport. They had expected pirates. Then they had expected no one. I took the first docking tube myself, because captains who send others into every uncertain room eventually discover their crews have begun keeping score. The hatch cycled under emergency hand crank logic, slow enough to make fear feel procedural. A woman met us on the far side in a pressure wrap darkened by coolant and blood. "You took your time," she said. "You're alive enough to insult me," I answered. "That's encouraging." That nearly won a smile. Nearly. Her name was Sol Avon, freight marshal, convoy master, and the sort of practical leader the frontier manufactures whenever governments decline the role often enough. She brought us into the ruined transfer hub and gave her report without ornament. The first escort vanished during a routine line correction. The second lost half its clocks before losing half its hull. The station beacons continued transmitting after their towers had already folded in on themselves. The star dimmed by fractions each hour, then recovered just enough to keep hope expensive. Most importantly, the losses did not begin at the center. They began where traffic had aligned too cleanly. Arlo would have loved her. In fact, he did. He arrived 10 minutes later with a recorder rig and the expression of a man trying to remain respectful while a living witness to impossible telemetry stood in front of him. Avon gave him one look and said, "If you ask whether the clocks failed before or after the light narrowed, I'll throw you back in the tube." Arlo nodded with painful sincerity. "That's fair." Briggs and his engineers stabilized the recycler and bullied the station grid into one more day of service. Tamsin and my flight crew ran shuttle passes through the debris line to pull the worst casualties out first. I remained with Avon in the central hub because the pattern mattered and because human beings tell the truth differently in person than they do to boards. "Did you see it?" I asked her. Avon considered the question like a person deciding whether she could afford honesty in front of one more stranger. "No," she said. "That's the worst part." She pointed through a split in the hull, plating toward the star. "If pirates had done this, I'd know what to hate. If an empire had done it, I'd know which flag to burn. But this—" She stopped. Started again. "We kept losing things before we could observe what was taking them. A line of ships gets narrower. A beacon transmits from nowhere. Light around the star becomes uncertain. Then someone is gone." That matched the map too well to be coincidence. Naira came into the hub while she spoke and stood near the cracked viewport with one hand pressed against the bulkhead. Avon watched her for 2 full seconds. "She's the one from the warnings," Avon said. "Warnings?" I asked. Avon nodded. "Mara Den pushed out a survival brief with your names attached. Pattern of hunger. Stagger doctrine. Do not move symmetrically under dimming conditions." I looked toward Arlo. His face did a small, embarrassed sort of pride. That was how doctrine becomes real. Not when a captain believes it. Not when a strategist explains it. When frightened people use it because they have no better alternative. Avon studied me with the exhausted steadiness of someone who had already buried enough of her own to lose interest in heroic language. "Does it work?" she asked. I considered lying for morale and decided I respected her too much for that. "It helps." That wasn't the question. "No," I said. "It wasn't." Naira turned from the viewport. "It works when the lane is still deciding, not when the hunt has already fixed relation." Avon closed her eyes briefly. "That's exactly the kind of sentence I didn't want." "Me neither," I said. Still, it mattered. There was a window between dimming and certainty, between wound and consumption, between being noticed and being fully taken. Small windows still count if you can build behavior around them. We evacuated the last survivors 3 hours later. Before we pulled away, Avon gave me a data rod containing convoy tracks, escort behavior, and the final recorder core from the first vanished frigate. "If your boy can make anything from that," she said, nodding toward Arlo, "let it be useful." "We will." She hesitated once before sealing her pressure collar. "And Varyn?" "Yes. When people start calling you hunters, remember who still needs hauling while you prove the name." Then she stepped into the shuttle and left me alone with the dead light. That line stayed with me all the way back to the Tempest. Warlikes turning names into banners, banners into myth, myth into permission for the living to become abstract. I had watched the Empire perform that conversion for years. I had no intention of repeating it under a better flag. On the bridge, Arlo cracked the recorder core and swore softly. The frigate saw something. The main glass filled with broken geometry, not a body, not a ship, a feeding line maybe, a narrowed relation moving through the root wound with the same hateful precision we had glimpsed at Xyraxis. Tamsin stared at it for half a beat, and then looked away the way people do when they realize fear has found a shape after all. Briggs said, "It isn't a fleet." "No," I answered. That was the problem. Fleets can be opposed. Fleets respect distance, tonnage, and the old mathematics of organized violence. This thing respected only access. I keyed shipwide and gave the order I had been trying not to need. "All stations. Book the dead light condition as active war contact. No civilian rescue lane runs without stagger doctrine. No clean convoy symmetry. No one treats dimming stars as weather again." The bridge acknowledged me in clipped voices. Outside, Serevon's damaged star kept burning with the strained confidence of something being watched by hunger from just beyond its own understanding. The war was beginning to teach us the cost of every late lesson. The answer, I suspected, would be paid in systems. Chapter 4. The First Adaptation. Briggs built the first adaptation out of insult, salvage, and a professional refusal to let the universe become mystical without a fight. After Serevon Reach, I went down to engineering and found 3 hull panels open, 2 support buses bypassed, and a resonance cage assembled from parts that had never consented to know one another. Briggs stood in the middle of it all with a spanner in one hand and the expression of a man prosecuting a case against creation. "How bad?" I asked. "Do you want the engineering answer or the captain's answer?" "The honest one?" He gave it to me. The predators were reading clean permission and elegant approach geometry faster than ordinary systems could confuse them. The Tempest had survived because the support architecture buried inside her hull knew how to exist inside wounded root logic. That was the good news. The bad news was that using it required Briggs to cooperate with old machinery he would normally report to a tribunal. Arlo arrived with the technical phrasing. The hunting lanes intensified where root sheath damage overlapped command failure. If we could drive asymmetry into our own support signature, we might stop reading like clean access and start reading like wounded infrastructure. Briggs translated that for the rest of us. "The predators like easy permission. I'm going to make the Tempest harder to read." Naira corrected him from the hatch. "Not invisible." That mattered. Invisibility was another kind of arrogance. If we vanished too completely, the root might notice. If we remained too legible, the hunt would. What we needed was a narrow, ugly middle state, damage that still belonged. Briggs liked the sentence so much he claimed it as his own before anyone could accuse him of listening. The first adaptation was not a weapon. That disappointed some part of me trained by old wars to expect salvation to look like firepower. What Briggs built instead was a masking discipline. Resonance bleed through the adjunct layer in broken intervals. Support harmonics offset from clean drive language. False consistency stripped out. Signal clutter introduced not as noise, but as wounded belonging. The hardest part was teaching the hull to misbehave on purpose without crossing into real failure. Engineers respect narrow bands. Captains romanticize them. Pilots try to punch through them. Tamsin asked how likely the procedure was to kill her if she did everything right. Briggs answered, only moderately, which on our ship had become almost reassuring. When he brought the masking cage live, the lights dimmed. The adjunct bus under the deck gave one long, low harmonic note, too deliberate for coincidence and too old for comfort. The Tempest no longer presented one clean support signature. She shimmered in related states, coherent enough to remain herself, damaged enough not to read as easy permission. Not stealth, survivable indecency. "Can we scale it?" I asked. Briggs disliked the question because he already knew the answer mattered, not to ordinary civilian hulls. They would cook themselves stupid. But escort ships, pirate cutters, convoy leaders, yes, with work, parts and crews disciplined enough not to improve themselves into death. So the engineering fix became doctrine. First adaptation protocol. Do not seek invisibility. Do not maintain clean support symmetry under dimming conditions. Use controlled asymmetry. Root-borne clutter is survivable. Elegant permission is not. Never assume one successful passage establishes safe recurrence. I told Briggs he had done good work. He looked offended. "That kind of talk ruins engineers," he said. Almost a smile followed me back up the ladder. Almost. Then he returned to teaching the Tempest how to sound like damage that still belonged. Chapter 5. Naira Between States. Naira told me the worst part was not hearing more. It was hearing herself less. That is the kind of sentence a captain carries differently than a strategist. Strategists hear capability. Captains hear cost. I found her in the chamber below the forward deck with a fragment sealed and the Tempest's masking cage humming through the bones of the ship. She was seated upright, too still, composed in the way people become when the body is cooperating only because the mind has issued strict orders. "You should sleep," I said. "I did. When?" "In the part of the route that still believed in yesterday." I closed my eyes once because command sometimes consists of not saying the useless thing too quickly. Zyraxis had changed her, not into something other. That would have been easier to name. It had made her less singular. The route no longer stopped neatly at the hull. She could feel wounded places before Aro mapped them. She could tell when a beacon still transmitted after its tower had been taken. Sometimes she knew which star would narrow before the instruments flagged deviation. Useful. I hated how useful it was. She tried to explain the state accurately. Not merge. Not yet. Merge was too clean a word, and nothing happening to her was clean. What she carried was a partial bridge state, unstable and controlled only by attention. She could reach farther into root relation than before, but she could also fail to return cleanly if pushed without anchor. Her anchors were not grand. My voice. Tamsin's impatience. Briggs cursing physical reality. Arlo trying to give horror a useful chart, the deck under her feet, her own name repeated until it felt held rather than assumed. Zyraxis did not finish the change, she said. It only made hiding from it impossible. I asked what she needed. The answer would have been easier if it had been technical. A machine, a filter, sleep, silence. Instead, she said, permission to be incomplete while useful. You never needed permission for that on this ship, I told her. That hurt her more than comfort would have, which was how I knew it had landed true. Then she reached, carefully, into a damaged root band above Obsidian Reach. The chamber thinned around us, not gone. Overlaid, lines of living geometry crossed steel and shadow. I watched her face become a person listening to a war older than language, and for one dangerous instant I understood how easy it would be for the old network to keep taking pieces of her because every piece it took made the rest of us more likely to survive. Her pulse skipped. The bridge state deepened. I took her wrist, not restraining, counting. Naira. She came back slowly. I'm here. Good. The chamber returned to itself. Steel, dim light, fragment cradle, breath. She could map the predators faster, but not indefinitely. Every deeper reach gave some of her back out of order. Then we use it carefully, I said. Careful use. That was my best answer to most terrible things. It was not enough. It was still better than surrender. When I left her, she remained in the chamber and said her name aloud softly. Naira Solis. I heard it once through the closing hatch. Not restoration, not completion, but enough self-intact to point the rest of us toward survival. Chapter 6. Rourke's Gambit. I did not stand on Rourke's operations tier when he made his gambit. That would have made the record cleaner, and this war rarely offered clean records. What I know of his thinking came from intercepted command bursts, stolen planning ladders, recovered recorder cores, and the shape of the operation itself. Men like Rourke reveal themselves in deployment as surely as they do in speech. He understood one truth before many of his peers did. Apocalypse would not cure politics. It would clarify ambition. The first SEAL failure at Syraxis altered the scale of the war, but it did not alter his central conviction that command still mattered, and that command, properly applied, belonged in disciplined hands. By then the frontier had begun learning too fast for him. Pirate traffic adopted asymmetry. Convoys staggered. Arlo's pattern of hunger moved through black flag relays, medical chains, and civilian ledgers faster than official doctrine could approve its own vocabulary. To Rourke, that was not merely adaptation. It was loss of monopoly. He answered by building an engagement, not a rescue, not openly, a test. 3 auxiliary hulls masked as supply transports, 2 shielded escorts. Reserve kill groups held off-axis. A wounded root sheath near Obsidian Reach seeded with false confidence and controlled imperial noise. The objective was to determine whether hunger could be lured into narrowed commitment and disrupted under managed conditions. Managed conditions did not exist. Rourke intended to create them by spending ships until the universe admitted a pattern. We saw the operation from the edge because Arlo's listening net caught the false convoy brightness before Rourke expected anyone outside his chain to read it. The geometry was too neat, the bait too carefully vulnerable, the escort pattern too disciplined to be civilian and too politically useful to be coincidence. "He is baiting it," Arlo said. "He's baiting us too," Tamsin answered. Both were true. We entered anyway, because the hulls might have been military auxiliaries, but crews are still crews, and the Predator line would not care whether the uniforms aboard had chosen the operation or merely been assigned to it. Rourke's first assumptions worked, dimming ahead of schedule. Beacon divergence. Local light narrowing around the convoy line. The thing hunting through the wounded sheath preferred certainty when certainty could be found, so we denied it certainty. Ressa's pirate packets widened the field. Arlo collapsed false confidence inside the route. Briggs drove a harmonic wound through the sheath behind the narrowing relation, rough and offensively human. Tamsin took the Tempest in with exactly enough audacity to become structural interference rather than heroism. The cost was immediate. One auxiliary folded in on itself under dark so clean the board flagged no explosion. Another lost half its escort line and kept transmitting gratitude to procedures no longer relevant. A pirate cutter came in too close and paid for bravado with its starboard section. Then the feeding line hesitated. Not mercy. Damage. 6 seconds is long enough for history to embarrass itself. Black flag squadrons hit the disrupted edge. Rourke's reserve fire landed across the same collapsing relation because he was not sentimental enough to waste opportunity merely because I had created it. For one impossible instant, appetite retreated rather than advanced. That was the real result, not victory. Proof. The predators could be hurt. More precisely, they could be made to spend. Rourke learned that. So did we. He also learned something he hated more. The frontier possessed a survival language that had not originated from the Empire. He would steal it, reframe it, and call the theft stability. I knew that before the next packet arrived. It was the law of empires. When the frontier discovers a working idea, the center first dismisses it, then steals it, then claims it had been doctrine all along. Chapter 7. The hunter becomes the hunted. I knew we had become important the moment the root started noticing us before the humans did. Tamsin felt it first at the helm. Pilots often receive truths before instruments do, not because they are mystical, but because survival has trained their bodies to hear motion lie. A lane that should have held clean narrowed half a heartbeat before commitment. A starfield reflection lagged behind our roll, as if light itself was listening, before deciding whether to remain loyal. A convoy stable for 4 hours began producing ghost distances the instant the Tempest crossed into escort range. Ugly truth first. We were now part of the pattern. Useful truth second. If the pattern noticed us, we could notice it noticing. We were screening fuel hulls, a medical transport, and 3 pirate fast escorts across the Karmara side when the convoy line drifted wrong. Not visibly enough for civilians. Enough for Tamsin. "Kale," she said. I looked up at once. I have ignored many warnings in my life. I have never survived by ignoring a pilot's first one. We are being anticipated. Briggs did not enjoy that sentence while strapped to his own repairs. Arlo confirmed it seconds later. The route clutter ahead was tightening around our masking signature. Not enough to trap, enough to align. Naira answered from below before I asked. The hunt had begun recognizing recurring interference. The tempest had become a marker. That was the danger of surviving too often in the same distinctive way. We were no longer merely helping convoys evade the predator lines. We were teaching the predator lines to recognize obstruction. Tamsin refused the obvious escape because clean flight would have taught the wrong lesson. Instead, she drove us across the convoy's relation line in 3 uneven burns, each one wrong enough to spoil elegant access, and right enough to keep us from teaching the route we were lost. Briggs fed masking clutter through the adjunct layer until the deck thrummed under my boots. Arlo sprayed false confidence into the convoy's old vector and collapsed it at the last moment. Pirate escorts split into rude asymmetrical teeth. One escort vanished. No fire. No heroism. Simply gone. That is the part battle songs always fail to carry. Most deaths do not arrive with dignity. They arrive while everyone else is still making the next calculation. The hunt tightened on us. I felt the room understand it. The tempest had become more interesting than the convoy. Not easier prey. Obstruction, anomaly, a surviving answer. "Now I can see it," Naira said from below. "What changed?" I asked. "It committed." That was the advantage hidden inside the danger. A predator line still deciding cannot be mapped cleanly. A predator line choosing you gives away shape for a few seconds. Arlo caught the approach curvature. Tamsin held 4 seconds longer than sanity recommended, then dragged the relation sideways through a maneuver no flight school would endorse without first dying of embarrassment. The commitment loosened. Pirate wolves cut across the disrupted edge. Briggs's harmonic hit the sheath. Arlo collapsed the false lane. Naira called timing from below. Bright pirate violence met wounded appetite in geometry too ugly for clean feeding, and the thing pursuing us paid for the preference. It recoiled, not defeated. Forced to surrender certainty. When the convoy cleared, I asked what we had proven. Arlo said obstruction could become bait. Briggs said he required stronger drink. Naira said the hunter could be made to choose badly. All true, but the lesson I carried was simpler. The hunt had begun to notice the Black Tempest. Therefore the Black Tempest could teach the hunt to regret noticing it. Chapter 8. The Living Map. The living map began in the chamber beneath the forward deck, with Nira seated beside the sealed fragment, and the rest of us pretending distance made the decision less personal. It did not. Tamsin's maneuver had proven we could turn recognition into bait. That created the next requirement immediately. If we wanted to draw the predators away from converging civilian routes, if we wanted movement guided by intent rather than fear, someone had to hear the hunting lines before they closed. That someone was Naira. I followed her to the hatch. Briggs had reinforced the field envelope. Arlo wanted telemetry badly enough to look ashamed of himself. Tamsin told Naira not to become so useful that the road kept her, which was as close to tenderness as she ever allowed in front of witnesses. Then Naira went inside alone. The field lowered. The chamber glass frosted with blue-white threadlight. Arlo's board screamed, then began translating in fragments. Kamara Rift, Obsidian Reach, Dead Cluster, Void Scar. Every named region ceased being place first and became pressure, denial, thinning, appetite, and evasion. Human maps disappeared under something older, invitations and prohibitions written in relation. Naira later told me the predators perceived the tempest as anomaly, not prey exactly. Briggs's modifications made us harder to read, not unreadable. We were an obstruction moving contrary to expected logic, not fleeing entirely, not asserting command in the imperial way, something between. A surviving answer. The map formed when her body stopped insisting on being the only border of her mind. The fragment became tuning surface. The ship became resonant platform. The old network opened in shards. Kill corridors, reserve bands, collapsed closures, wounded command points. Then she saw 3 convergences. One false, one fatal. One survivable if timed precisely and approached as question rather than challenge. She came out of the first descent hard enough to hit the deck. I was through the hatch before the alarm made up its mind. "Talk to me. 3 lines," she said. "The next month of the war, one they want us to see, one they want us to die in, one we can use." Arlo asked if she could mark it. "No," I said at the same time she said yes, because marking it meant holding the map longer. Holding the map meant letting the bridge stay deepen. The path back had returned once. That was not a promise. "How much?" I asked. "Enough?" "That is not a number. It is the honest answer." If she started to lose herself, I told her I would pull her back even if it cost us the path. She heard me, then she went under again. The second descent was worse, because it came easier. She pressed the selected path through the Tempest's systems not as coordinates but relation. Tamsin's helm lit with impossible curves. Briggs demanded to know why the ship suddenly believed in predictive blasphemy. Arlo translated fast enough to make terror useful. For one moment the living map became visible to all of us, thin white lines moving against the stars, like thoughts deciding where matter might deserve passage. Tamsin looked at it and said, "I can fly that." Of course she could. We sent the filtered version to Ressa, the frontier cells, and every pirate house still sober enough to prefer survival over pride. Then I ended the contact before Nira could spend another piece of herself reaching for one more useful line. The field snapped up. She screamed once when the stars became merely stars again. I held her until breath returned. "Did it work?" she asked. "Yes. For that phase of the war, yes had to be enough. Chapter 9, the broken defense line. Old defenses are most dangerous when they have already failed once. The living map led us to the edge of the dead cluster where no captain in his right mind would have chosen to linger unless forced by prophecy, war, or the sort of practical desperation frontier people often rename as duty. There, wrapped around a dead orange star, and half buried in its own ruined support geometry, waited the remnants of an architect defense ring. Not a gate, not a fleet berth, a line. That was the first thing I understood when the structure resolved through our sensors and Tamsin brought us into observational orbit under every mask Briggs could invent. The ring was too wide for transit elegance, and too heavily layered for ceremony. Segment after segment lay shattered around the star in disciplined arcs, each one paired to dead-firing sheaths and reserve relay crowns now open to vacuum. Arlo breathed. They made a wall around the sun. "No," Naira said from the command chair, pale but steady. "They made a refusal. That was closer. The defense line had a name in the surviving lattice. Carthelvaric, or the nearest human failure to whatever the architects had once meant by it. The archive ghosts still hanging in the ruins told enough story to bruise. Here, long before we existed, a full containment action had failed under sustained predator pressure. Fleets had died in sequence. Whole root branches had been cut away. And still the line had broken. Briggs leaned over the sensor feed and let out one low, bitter laugh. "Good. Excellent. Our predecessors built a stellar siege wall, and it still wasn't enough. I feel wonderfully equipped." "Do you ever say hopeful things on purpose?" Tamsin asked. "I'm an engineer, not a prayer service. I looked at the ruins and thought of all the false comforts men like Rourke prefer. More ships, better weapons, correct doctrine, cleaner chains of command. Human history remains drunk on scale." Carthelvaric stood before us as proof that scale alone had once failed a civilization older than ours by ages enough to make empires look adolescent. "Can we read the line?" I asked. Arlo nodded, then shook his head. "Some of it. The archive layer is scorched, but there are combat records still cached in the relay bones." Naira added quietly, "and memory in the wound." I let Briggs and Arlo pull the data while Tamsin held us in a patient drift beneath the broken segments. The defense ring did not feel dead so much as exhausted beyond ceremony. White lattice flickered inside one ruin mouth. A line of black pylons rotated without thrust. In several places the dark between segments seemed too intentional to be called emptiness. The recovered records were worse than I expected, not because of gore, because of discipline. Architect fleet doctrine here had not been improvisation. It had been calculated sacrifice scaled to the level of stars, partition lines collapsing exactly when civilian evacuation windows closed. Reserve hulls ordered into feeding channels not to win, but to buy denial time elsewhere. Whole system sectors abandoned under command logic so old and cold that any human admiral would have called it monstrous, while quietly admiring the efficiency. "Show me the final sequence," I said. Arlo hesitated only a moment before projecting it. The ring awakened in ghostlight across our glass. Segment crowns lit. Kill corridors hardened. Fleet layers folded inward around the star. For one glorious minute it looked winnable. Then the pressure shadow arrived, and the records began losing confidence. Ships vanished from one frame and reappeared in another already dead. Relay logic repeated contradictory orders. One entire command branch continued fighting 23 seconds after its own destruction because sequence itself had been damaged. At the center of the collapse, the line's final commander issued the only surviving full directive in the record: deny feeding, preserve elsewhere, accept local loss. The words landed on the bridge like verdict. Tamsin broke the silence first. That is not the sort of sentence people make tattoos out of. No, I said. It's the sort they survive by and hate later. Naira stood slowly and came to the forward glass. They hurt the predators here, she said. Arlo blinked. How can you tell? Because the line failed too late. That was not an answer any of us liked, which was how we knew it mattered. Briggs turned from the archive feed to me. If they wounded them, then maybe the network still can. Not in one piece, Naira said. In relation. In sequence. In coordinated refusal. There it was again. Not one weapon. Not one command point. A system of wounded denials, timing, bait, sacrifice, and chosen channels. The war we needed was not navy against monster. It was movement against appetite. Arlo pulled one more surviving schematic from the ring's relay bones and expanded it over our current pathing model. A hidden support line ran from D.R.Varyn's remains back toward Obsidian and forward toward the outer burning expanse lanes. Not intact, not safe, but present enough to matter if combined with the living map. I, pirate captain, former Imperial officer, accidental symbol, found myself staring at the shape of future doctrine in a dead alien ruin and wishing history would grow less ambitious around me. It did not. Can we use it? I asked. Briggs rubbed one hand over his beard. In pieces, we salvage firing principles, timing windows, maybe some resonance tricks if the Tempest support layer stops behaving like a secretive priesthood. Tamsin angled one brow. And if it doesn't? Then I complain louder. D.R.Varyn had failed, but failure still leaves instruction for people honest enough to read it without turning it into hero worship. That was our task now, not mourning the old line, learning how to wound what it had failed to kill. I looked once more at the final directive. Preserve elsewhere. That, more than anything, was the correct shape of our duty now. We were no longer the crew seeking the next gate. We were the people who had to decide where civilization deserved to remain available, and what ugliness would be required to keep it so. I ordered the archive copied in full. Then I ordered course laid for the next convergence line, because knowing the old defense had failed did not absolve us of building the next one. It only stripped away the luxury of innocence while we did it. Chapter 10. The Cost of Knowing. D.R.Varyn left ghosts in Nira, not theatrical visions. Worse, functional impressions, firing sequences, sacrifice hierarchies, route thickening, harmonics that could wound feeding channels if held with enough precision and enough price. Useful truths. The most expensive kind. We paid that price at Obsidian Reach while trying to route 3 refugee clusters past a converging hunt line. Tamsin flew. Arlo managed traffic. Briggs cursed mask routines into survivable behavior. I held command broad enough to keep panic from becoming doctrine. Naira went down into the chamber because there was no other way to hear which route still qualified as mercy. The field lowered. This time the living map did not merely clarify, it took her. The first warning came through her voice over the chamber speaker. Not loud, not panicked, too exact. Do not reinforce by weight. I called her name. She did not answer as herself at first. The old network had aligned behind her voice, not replacing it fully, but using the channel she had become. The refugee clusters shone on Arlo's boards as frightened concentrations. Imperial movements flashed with clean command arrogance. Pirate swarms flickered irregular and hard to classify. Predator lines crossed them all like dark veins carrying appetite from wound to wound. One refugee cluster was choosing the obvious lane. It would die there because obviousness had become prey behavior. Another line through a half-collapsed service sheath could hold if a command harmonic thickened refusal at precisely the correct beat. The old language gave Naira that beat. It also took her name for several seconds. She stood in the chamber while alarms rose across the ship, or perhaps only her mind stood. It is difficult to describe what happens when a person becomes partly root and partly body, while the rest of us keep needing her to be both. She sent the harmonic through the Tempest's hidden lair, across the wounded route, into the service sheath the refugees had not yet chosen. Briggs shouted something offended. Arlo changed 3 traffic packets at once. Tamsin snapped a civilian convoy broadside across a vector no sane pilot would have trusted. The line thickened. The refugees lived. Then the cost arrived. Memory peeled from her in small pieces. Not the grand losses stories prefer, but intimate ones, tastes, colours, one of Tamsin's bad songs, details from corridors we had survived together. Not erased, unhoused. When I reached the chamber, her mouth was shaping architect logic, a command string, a prayer, a denial sequence. I do not know which. No one should hear a friend sound like a dead civilization while saving civilians. I did the only thing no network would have thought to optimize. I took her face in both hands and said her name like refusal. Nira Solis. The bridge state broke. She fell hard enough to bruise. Air returned to her as pain. The stars became distant again. Briggs arrived with half a med kit and all his fury. Tamsin stood in the hatch, breathing fast enough to make sarcasm late. Arlo looked white enough to become part of his own screens. How much did we lose? I asked. I did not mean ships. Naira turned inward carefully. Some memories remained. Some had shifted beyond reach. Her name was hers again, her body mostly. Her love for the crew intact. Not enough to stop, she said. It was the worst answer in the galaxy. It was also true. Now we knew in blood and memory that the bridge state was possible. The price was real. The war would demand it again. Chapter 11. The Star Hunters. Names matter because they tell frightened people what shape to build their courage in. For too many weeks we had been running a war without the dignity of a proper noun. Predators, yes. Hunger, certainly. Seal failure line, living map, wounded routes, dimming systems. All accurate, all insufficient. Accuracy alone does not organize men and women into purpose once losses start arriving faster than hope. So I called the council in the dark above Obsidian Reach and told them what we were now. Not pirates, not explorers, not gate runners. Hunters. The word travelled badly at first. Good. Easy words are usually wrong. Reservain, attended by Hardline, burst from her warship-red banner with 4 clan captains arranged behind her like a skeptical weather pattern. Administrator Sol Avon from the Mere Reach survivors patched in from a relief convoy still carrying seed cargo and trauma in equal measure. 2 frontier resistance delegates from Talos Break, and Aldara joined with the grim patience of people who had already survived the Empire and resented having to outlive the cosmos next. Arlo handled the network. Briggs handled the room by looking like he would happily weld shut any mouth wasting time. Tamsin sprawled in the secondary command chair like Velocity given legal representation. Naira remained on the bridge, though pale, because absence would have frightened them more. I let them argue for 3 minutes. That was generous. Then I cut the table cold. The old war failed because it treated survival as local, I said. 1 world, 1 fleet, 1 line. We don't have that luxury. The predators learn from movement and feed through weakened permissions. That means our choices matter before battle even starts. Reservain leaned toward her pickup with the expression of a woman who had murdered better speeches. And what exactly are you proposing, D.R.Varyn? Pirate convoys hunting suns? No. I brought Cathel Varric's archive up over the table, then the living map routes, then the field data from Mere Reach and the dead light systems. I'm proposing we stop thinking like prey, refugees, or line admirals. We build moving refusal. We bait where we choose. We reinforce where the old network can still wound them. We deny easy feeding and make every approach cost more than the last. One of the clan captains laughed outright. You want pirates to do doctrine. I want survivors to do math. That killed the room better than shouting would have. Briggs picked up the next part because he enjoys explaining ugly things, as if the universe is foolish for needing clarification. The Tempest's mask routines can be copied in reduced form. Not the whole package. Enough to make your ships less informative. Fly sloppier. Signal dirtier. Stop giving every machine in creation a clean confession of what you mean to do. Tamsin added, and if you feel the irresistible urge to maintain bright formation while something cosmic eats the stars, kindly wait until after you're dead. That helped more than she knew. People hear practical terror better when it comes dressed like insult. Naira spoke next, and the room quieted in the instinctive way rooms now do around her. Not reverence. Recognition. The predators do not merely chase light, she said. They pursue usable pattern, dense traffic, obvious retreat, command certainty. If we learn to bend those patterns, we do not win. We survive with influence. Sol Avon from mere reach nodded once. That is enough of a religion for me. In the end, they agreed because reality had become harsher than pride. Pirate houses committed wolf-pack screens across Karmara and Obsidian. Frontier cells took warning line duty. Civilian convoys accepted staggered doctrine even though it felt like disorder to frightened people. Reservain promised 3 fast squadrons and the sort of loyalty that always sounds like a threat when spoken by honest pirates. That made the name real. Not because we hunted them like beasts, because if we did not learn how to stalk the patterns of their hunger, then the stars themselves would continue becoming livestock around us. The first intentional engagement came 40 hours later. A predator fragment, not the whole feeding condition, only a narrowed projection riding ahead of a larger hunt line, moved toward a fuel convoy we had deliberately brightened at the edge of the dead cluster. The convoy was real. So were the civilians hidden under the escort hulls. Bait in this war could not be entirely false, or the predators learned too quickly. That was the horror of it. We laid the trap anyway. Ressa's fast ships held wide dark. Avon's convoy drifted bright and frightened by design. Briggs fed resonance through the Tempest's support layer until the hull beneath my boots sounded like a held argument. Arlo watched the approach geometry tighten. Tamsin smiled in the way that makes decent men nervous. Naira sat in the chamber below, not fully bridged this time, but listening enough to call the timing. Now, she said. We moved. Ressa's squadrons cut the obvious retreat path. The convoy split not outward but asymmetrically, denying the compression the predator line expected. Briggs drove a masked harmonic into the wounded root sheath behind the fragment. And the Tempest, my impossible, infuriating ship, burned straight through the line of easiest permission as if daring appetite to learn a harder lesson. The fragment thickened around us in field dark. Stars narrowed. One escort vanished with all hands and no time for heroism. Another lost its port section and kept transmitting thanks until the signal died. That part would stay with me. Then the harmonic caught, not explosion, not victory music, a wound. The fragment recoiled, the feeding line around it folded inward badly. For 6 crucial seconds, the hunger lost clean relation to the convoy, and the Wolfpack squadrons pounced on the only thing in this war that still behaved like opportunity. Disrupted access. They hurt it. I know the sentence sounds impossible. It should. But the fragment did not simply leave. It tore loose from the root with the same offended wrongness we had seen in Deadlight Wakes, and when it withdrew, the stars behind it returned with enough confidence to qualify as survival. We had not won. We had not even destroyed what came for us, but we had forced appetite to pay. The bridge of the Tempest remained silent until Arlo said very softly that counted. Briggs, for once, did not insult the wording. Yes, Reservain came back overburst with blood on one cheek, and the delighted fury of a woman who had just discovered the future might still include profitable defiance. Well, she said, now I'm interested. That was the frontier in one sentence. We came out of the engagement with losses. Civilian dead. 1 pirate cutter ruined. 2 escorts wounded. Naira shaking in the chamber because even limited contact still scraped self from signal in ways I could not protect her from entirely. And yet the result held. A line delayed. A convoy saved. A fragment wounded. A new doctrine proven possible. I looked around by bridge then. At Tamsin flushed with survival and speed, Briggs covered in sweat and contempt. Arlo staring at the returning stars like data had become faith. Nira climbing back from the edge of a greater listening with her name still intact, and understood that we had crossed a threshold of our own. The crew of the Black Tempest had stopped being people chased by the story. We were now helping define how the story would fight back. Chapter 12, The War Expands. Wars begin locally and end dishonestly. That is one of the oldest truths I know. The first losses always belong to a place with a name small enough to be ignored by the core. A colony, a yard, a freight lane, a bread world. Administrators dismiss it, governors delay it, admirals interpret it, and by the time the truth becomes large enough for official language to notice, the war has already taught half the frontier how to bury their dead faster than policy can count them. The last movement of that season did not offer us the luxury of pretending the war remained local. The line broke open across 3 sectors at once. Dead cluster warning traffic multiplied. Obsidian Reach lost 2 convoy corridors in 1 week. Kamara Rift turned from ugly to strategic as every surviving packet realized the wound lines there could either kill them or hide them depending on timing. And farther coreward, colonial systems that had once argued over pirate tolls now began sending envoys under emergency flags to anyone claiming the Star Hunters had real doctrine, and not only brave anecdotes. Reservain called it bad for margins. Sol Avon called it history. I called it inevitable, and kept moving. The Black Tempest became a travelling command wound of our own. Not in the old architect sense. In the human one. Everywhere we went, we stitched together temporary alliance from things that should not have fit. Pirate wolf packs flying stagger doctrine beside colonial convoy marshals, former imperial defectors feeding us real fleet response windows. Grain worlds trading fuel for escort protection. Resistance cells turning civilian traffic into adaptive swarm logic instead of orderly slaughter. It was not pretty. Good. Pretty wars are usually propaganda viewed from a safe distance. Arlo spent his days buried under warning networks, trying to keep half the frontier's relays from collapsing under their own desperation. Briggs turned the Kamara mask package into a rough kit other ships could actually install without exploding, which for Briggs qualified as charity of almost spiritual dimensions. Tamsin trained pilots in bait-and-draw maneuvers, while insulting their family lines, reflexes, and moral courage with equal opportunity professionalism. Ressa's captains pretended to object and copied every instruction anyway. Naira moved among us like a person returning from too many borders at once. The bridge state no longer took her entirely by surprise. That was its own form of grief. She could hear route changes before packets, knew which warnings were urgent by the way silence thickened around them, and sometimes paused mid-conversation because a deadline 3 systems away had just shifted pressure in a direction no one else yet understood. She remained Naira, entirely, but now with edges listening beyond the room. That frightened people. It also saved them. The final crisis arrived from 3 directions at once, because history loves symmetry only when it becomes expensive. A relief convoy from Aldara and Talos entered Obsidian under escort. Rourke committed a fresh imperial wedge toward the same convergence because he had concluded, correctly, that surviving route doctrine could no longer be left entirely to pirates. And a major hunt line bent out of the dead cluster toward all of it with the cold inevitability of appetite, discovering that civilization had once again arranged itself in edible density. I gathered the War Council aboard the Tempest because neutral ground had become a joke, and my ship at least told lies consistently. Ressa appeared over Hardline Burst. Sol Avon in person from the relief convoy. A former Imperial Commodore named Sarek Dole defected 3 days earlier after watching one of Rourke's rescue screens get interpreted as bait by the Predators. Arlo ran the board. Briggs ran the contempt. Tamsin ran out of patience. Naira stood by the living map and listened. The answer was ugly enough to work. We would split the convoy not by value but by survivability. Civilian life first, high-yield cargo second, political comfort never. We would let Rourke's wedge become visible mass because he still believed mass deserved explanatory privilege. We would use the living map to bleed the hunt line across a wounded service sheath where Briggs's harmonics and the Coalition's distributed mask routines could thicken refusal for one short impossible interval. And if that failed, Tamsin would draw the line herself across broken space with the Tempest as the brightest useful lie in the region. "Terrible," Ressa said approvingly. "Efficient," Dole said with visible nausea. "Human," Sol Avon answered. Naira lifted one hand toward the map. "Now," she said. The room vanished into function. What followed was the largest moving coordination we had attempted so far, and not one part of it resembled classical fleet battle. Convoys scattered by design. Pirate wolf packs flashed in and out like knives, deciding not to announce themselves. Imperial destroyers tried to maintain line integrity while route geometry itself kept suggesting that integrity was a form of surrender. The Tempest moved between them all as escort, decoy, adjunct, and defense by interpretation. The Predators came. Not the whole of them, not yet, but enough of the hunt line entered the convergence to make stars lose confidence, and every soul present understand that the next phase would inherit a galaxy already burning at the edges. Naira bridged harder than I wanted, and less than she eventually would. Briggs drove the harmonics until his boards bled warning colours no human engineer should have had to accept as normal. Tamsin flew us across 3 wounded routes and 1 dead maintenance line that should have been inaccessible to any sane ship. Arlo rerouted convoy packets in real time while swearing at 7 systems worth of frightened captains. Ressa's fast ships cut off compression points. Dole, to his credit, ordered his Imperial defectors to screen civilians before protecting their own hulls. And for one stretched impossible interval the line held. Civilians got out. Cargo mostly followed. Rorke's Wedge took the heavier loss because order remained too visible to survive unmodified in this war. The hunt line fed badly and withdrew angry. Angry is useful. Angry means cost. When the last transmissions settled and the surviving convoys reached cold dark, I stood on the command deck and looked at the casualty lists with the familiar hatred only war can teach properly. Dead pirates, dead civilians, defectors who chose the right side too late to enjoy the decision. The victory was real and insufficient in equal measure. That is another old truth. Winning only means the scale of tomorrow's problem has grown. Arlo broke the silence first. 3 new dimming reports from the outer burning expanse. Briggs sat down hard on the engineering step like a man briefly negotiating with age. Of course there are. Tamsin came off the helm with a grin too tired to qualify as triumph. Tell me at least one thing is getting simpler. No, I said. Ressa's image remained on the burst long enough to say what the frontier was already beginning to understand. You have a war now, Kyle. I looked around my bridge. At the crew, at Naira, pale but upright, at the stars ahead already arranging themselves into the next disaster. No, I said. We all do. That was the truth of our situation. Not that we had solved anything, only that the galaxy could no longer pretend the solving belonged to someone else. Coda toward the burning expanse. The war did not become clearer after the first intentional wound we put into a predator fragment. It became legible. That distinction cost us dimming stars, wounded convoys, pirate dead, triage wards on worlds that had once believed catastrophe belonged somewhere farther away, and the repeated humiliation of learning that survival doctrine is not victory merely because frightened people begin repeating it. The old network remained broken. The predators remained real. Walk remained dangerous. And the Black Tempest moved through all 3 truths like a ship, trying not to become symbol while everyone around her kept insisting on the convenience. The frontier changed tone in those days. Not hope. Hope is too soft and too eager to call itself permanent. What grew instead was leaner, coordination. Pirate houses committed wolfpack screens across Kamara and Obsidian. Frontier med relays adopted dead-light triage tags before governors authorized the vocabulary. Civilian convoys accepted stagger doctrine, even though it felt like disorder to frightened captains. Mara Den helped turn pattern of hunger from a technical brief into a human network, which meant the truth could travel without waiting for officials to approve its shoes. Inside the Tempest, each of us moved 1 degree farther into function. Briggs stopped calling the adjunct layer a nuisance and began calling it a bastard, which in his private language qualified as intimacy. Arlo no longer flinched when maps expanded from ships into sectors. Tamsin smiled more sharply and slept less, which meant she felt alive in the worst possible era and intended to remain difficult for extinction. Naira did not heal. The bridge state held. She could hear wounded lanes and places where old architect discipline still denied full collapse. She could also feel the temptation to remain in the route too long, because the route always offered 1 more useful layer if she was willing to spend self to reach it. I watched her anchor herself. Name, ship, deck, crew, breath. Small things only to people who have never had to fight to remain singular. At shift's edge we gathered around Arlo's strategic field, while Kamara Rift drifted past the glass. Dead cluster, Obsidian reach. Kamara wound lines, colonial packets, pirate wolfpacks, imperial test lanes. Farther out, burning expanse warning arcs began forming where losses no longer respected local arrogance. Tamsin asked me to tell her the next move was not to go politely improve the apocalypse. No, I said. Good. The next move is to keep the frontier alive long enough to become inconvenient at scale. That pleased her more. Arlo lifted 1 hand toward the outer arcs. Then the next phase is where this stops being survival in pockets. No one corrected him. Xyraxis had broken the lock. The Star Hunter phase taught us how to move under hunger. The burning expanse would make the war impossible to localize. The stars ahead were still beautiful in the rude, indifferent way stars always are, even when hunger has begun educating itself between them. We had not won. We had done something smaller and more valuable. We had taught the future that it could still be contested. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next release, future chapters, and every new journey into the Void Corsair saga. The gates are waking. The Empire is coming, and the Black Tempest is not done running yet.